just going to share my screen. I just want to check how you're viewing it. Let me see if I can get it into full screen. 1 second. It's always different with different options. Okay, I'm going to present a view, but I'm not sure it's giving me a full screen here. Let me try this. Okay, how's that? Can you see my screen? Perfect. Okay, it's not quite fully full screen, but we'll start here. So thank you everyone for joining the call. So this talk is called Leadership in Exponential Times. To make it a bit more interactive, what I'm going to do is, normally I do the whole talk straight through, but what I'll do is I'll pause at various sections and ask everyone to kind of put some questions in the chat or some comments. If you can, put your videos on, because it's nice to see everyone's faces and see, well, nice for me to see your faces when I say some of the stuff I'm going to say during this presentation. And usually some people's mouths drop open, which is good fun. But you're usually a very up-to-date group of people. I'm usually sure of that. So you'll have aware of some of the stuff I'm going to go into. So there's a lot of slides, so I'll go quickly. And then if you do have any questions along the way, please put them in the chat. And if I can ask Helena to just pull out any of the relevant questions, and then we can go from there. So let's start with a story. This chap, Thomas Midgley. Does anyone know who he is? Any comments in the chat? Let's see, some people typing away. So Thomas was an American mechanical and chemical engineer. And in the 1930s, he developed a non-poisonous substance that was used in inhalers and aerosol sprays, and instead of other toxic flammable chemicals. So he had a really great positive impact in the world at the time. He was awarded the Perkin Medal from the Society of Chemical Industry, the highest award in the US chemical industry. The American Chemical Society gave them his highest award. And he had 2 honorary degrees, and he was elected to the United States National Academy of Sciences. And in 1944, he was elected president and chairman of the American Chemical Society. He won 5 major awards in his lifetime. Does anyone want to guess what he invented? Any guesses? Let's see in the chat. So he invented CFCs, chlorinated fluorocarbons, and was responsible effectively. I think someone described him as the person that had the greatest negative environmental impact of any individual ever, by punching a massive hole in the ozone layer. And he was also, ironically, one of the earliest inventors of leaded petrol as well. So what this talk is going to be about is, what does leadership in exponential times look like, and what's the difference between the types of impact we try and have in the world and what we end up having in reality. So humanity in the 20th century had an extraordinary century of progress. Life expectancy more than doubled, infant mortality dropped by 90%, maternal mortality by 99%. You can see some of those statements there. And why? The reason was that mostly driven by abundance created through technology. And I'm going to show you some examples of that as we go through. So anyone want to guess, and please do put comments in the chat, what this chart represents? Okay, so what you're seeing is a price in British pounds for the year 2000 dropping from close to £40,000 all the way down to 2006, where it was 3 British pounds from the 1300s to 2006. Does anyone want to guess what this thing is? And I'm expecting more interaction. Any ideas in the chat? I'll wait to see. Come on, let's see some things. Okay, what have we got? Cost of some essential item. Yeah, any guesses? All right. So this is the chart for the cost of light. So in Babylonian times, it took 50 hours of work to get 1 hour of light. And that was oil back then. In 1880s, kerosene, you had to work for 15 minutes to get 1 hour of light. And nowadays, it's probably even less now, but half a second of work at average salaries will give you an hour of light. Now, this gives you an example of the abundance as a species we've been creating over time. And there you go, that's it. Price for lighting per million lumen hours in the UK. So what we're going to cover today is how to think about exponentiality, what's happening in the world today, some new breeds of organizations that are being created, which would be good for some of the more entrepreneurial types amongst you. And what does this mean for you as an individual? So just to go through me just quickly. So Wolf of Wall Street picture was there. I started off as an investment banker, which did not suit me at all. Then I went on to become a strategy consultant, which is why those question marks are there, because no one knows actually really what a strategy consultant does. No one can really define it, not even strategy consultants. The picture on the right there is I set up a small company with a lending license for peer-to-peer lending in the UK. It wasn't actually a business, it was just a shell company with the license, which I sold to a large fund back in 2016, I think it was. It wasn't a life-changing amount of money, but effectively, I can say I have an exit on my record. Also invested a bit in property, trying to create Patel Towers, but just a few in London. And I also am a chartered accountant and a chartered financial analyst. The reason those arrows are there, I was the only person crazy enough to do those two qualifications at the same time. So I did 6 years of exams in 3 years, passing all of them first time. And the right-hand side picture at the bottom is Shakespeare, because I'm also write poetry, and I'm also a prize-winning poet and have been published. Not a full collection yet, but published in magazines and various competitions. What I do at the moment, my main job is working as the Chief Product Officer for a company called EXO Works. And what we do is we help large companies create their own disruptive startups or initiatives for their business. And you can see some of the clients that we work for there. Effectively, we coach client teams through a 10-week process, and we teach them to work and behave in agile fashions. And also at the end of the 10 weeks, the leadership of that company gets pitched 8 startup ideas in a kind of Dragon's Den or Shark Tank style approach. And we have a very high implementation rate and success rate on the funding of these ideas and initiatives. You can look those up online if you want. Just as a quick example, one of our main clients is Procter & Gamble. They're on track to deliver something along the lines of $500 million of benefits from the sprints that we've run with them. And Interprotection, which was a Mexican insurer, they doubled revenue and tripled profits in the 3 years after we ran the sprint with them. Okay, so we're going to start off with the first main section, which is frameworks for thinking around exponentiality. So how many of you, again, please put some comments in there, just say yes, are familiar with Moore's law? Okay. Yes, there's a few people there. So Moore's law is the observation that the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. And it was something observed by Gordon Moore, the founder of, well, the co-founder of Intel. And as you can see there from the 1970s, from the various chips, this was the kind of exponential curve that was seen. And the reason it's a straight line is if you look on the left, the scale is an exponential scale on the left-hand side. However, what happened was Ray Kurzweil, who's a futurist, very, very intelligent man, realized that actually Moore's law was the 5th paradigm in computing. And actually this had been going on since the 1900s. And he called this the law of accelerating returns. And as you see there, there's a very, very consistent exponential curve happening from back in the 1900s. And the interesting thing to note is that you do not see the effect of the world wars on this chart. So that has been consistent through the world wars, been consistent through the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, I think it was. And this has been technical progress that hasn't slowed down. And the way to look at it is if you look at Moore's law, and this is a chart kindly reproduced from Rod Lipson, is this is what it actually looks like if you look at it on a linear scale. So it effectively looks like zero progress up until around the year 2005, 2006, and then we see a complete takeoff. The reason it's important looking at this is that human beings didn't evolve to understand exponentiality. We evolved living a life that's local and linear. And actually the way life is starting to work more and more from technology, but also as you've seen recently from the coronavirus, is exponentially and globally. And I think one of the reasons why countries did not anticipate the coronavirus as they could have done or should have done, is this kind of inability to think in exponential terms, or at least be able to react in exponential terms. We can think in exponential terms when we're doing like disaster movies like Contagion, or that computer game called Plague. But actually in reality, in reacting to it, we don't necessarily react to it. And I'll give you some really good example here. This chart shows the annual photovoltaic additions, which is the thick black line, and that's real historic data, versus what the International Energy Agency in their World Energy Outlook predicted every year. And if you look at this curve, what you see is that every year, the prediction carried on as a horizontal line continuing out from every year. And they continue to do this year after year after year. Okay. And if you look in the latest one, there was actually a drop. As you can see, it kind of drops down again. This is the inability of us as human beings, or experts, even experts in these spaces, to be able to think in exponential terms. So what happens when we have exponential technologies or exponential impacts happening? Well, what we're seeing is the digitization of technology. And what happens is once, and this is a framework from Pieter Diamandis, once a technology becomes digitized, it can be replicated and sold for close to zero cost. And then it follows this 6D curve. So I'll give you a good example here, is of digital cameras. So if you look at the left-hand side, that's the first digital camera. It was invented by Kodak, by a gentleman called Stephen Sasson. And when he first showed these devices to his bosses at Kodak in 1975, they basically dismissed it. It took 50 milliseconds to capture the image, but 23 seconds to record it to tape. And it was 0.01 megapixels. And it would take about 30 seconds once the cassette was put into a player to bring up a 100 by 100 pixel black and white image. But what happened was you digitize now the process of taking a picture. And what happened was over years, there was this deceptive growth where I think every 18 months to 2 years, it doubled, then to 0.02 megapixels, then to 0.04. But these doublings are so small in absolute terms, people don't pay attention to it until you get to a size where it becomes disruptive, where you get to 1 megapixel, then 2, then 4, and then suddenly it's at the resolution that the human eye can't tell. That's a pixelated image. Then it becomes dematerialized. As you see, it became part of, basically the cameras became part of our phones. And then it becomes demonetized, right? Now it doesn't really, no one would pay really anything for a small digital camera anymore, because effectively there's no value attached to it. And then it becomes democratized. So anybody that has these cameras, and smartphones are now ubiquitous, you'll find them across the developing world as well, is that this technology now becomes available to the hands of many people. And you can see this happening, for example, with online education materials. It's also happening and in multiple areas. And what we're seeing is many disruptive technologies all becoming mainstream at once. This is a sample, there's 15 here, but you could define these all in different ways. But we've never seen this kind of effect before, where all of these technologies are becoming mainstream all at once. And effectively, it's called 20 Gutenberg moments. The Gutenberg printing press is purported to be the moment at which reading suddenly took off across the world, because we were able to print very cheaply. There's a little bit of debate about that, but the idea is that what we're seeing is this rapid acceleration and convergence across multiple technologies happening at the same time. So any quick questions on any of that? I'll give us a breather there. Any comments in the chat? It'd be nice to see some faces as well. I think we've got everyone's videos, most videos are off. Any comments there? Okay. So what's going on in the world today? Has anyone, is there any 20 of those you say has more potential? I think quantum computing has the biggest potential of all the technologies. I think if we get that right, that's gonna, I think that's like a base technology that will, just cause massive improvements across all of the others potentially. If you look it up, there's actually something called, I think it's called the periodic table of technology or exponential technologies. I think Imperial University put that together. So it's a really interesting one. Applied AI research. No, you're in a good business. You're in a good business, yeah. So what's going on in the world today? I'm going to give you some examples. So anyone seen this picture before? So what this picture is, it's of a CNN, which is a type of classifier using AI, and it achieved achieved basically 90% accuracy in being able to separate criminals and non-criminals from an ID photo in China. Okay, so they collected almost 2,000 ID photos that satisfied the following criteria: Chinese male between the ages of 18 to 55, no facial hair, no facial scars or other markings, and 730 of them were criminals whose images were provided by the police. And this classifier was able to tell with 90% accuracy which ones were the criminal and which ones were not. And we'll come back to this in a while. This was widely reported in the news. Now, we've all seen this thing about, and Yannick, you're not allowed to say anything in this one. We've seen this thing about how images can be reconstructed by AI. And this is actually something that's a few years old, but this was the effect of an AI trying to recreate these pictures of a goldfish, of an owl, etc. So it didn't do too bad a job, right? It's kind of getting there. Anyone want to guess what the trick with this AI was in particular? So these images were not recreated by the AI by looking at the original image. This was recreated by the AI looking at data from an fMRI, gathering brain data activity from the subjects as they looked at the image. So this was interpreting the brain waves of people who were looking at the images, and then those images being reconstructed by the neural network. And this is how accurate it was able to be with those reconstructions. And this is obviously a few years old. This was done by Kyoto University. And if you see, these are pretty, it's pretty startling how accurate they were able to be. And then they tried, even though this was, this neural net was tested on imagery, they tried it on letters. And this is the success they had. So by analyzing the brain images, they could effectively see the letters that these people were looking at. Interesting, huh? Now, Elon Musk has gone on record for saying that, competition for AI superiority, he thinks, will be the thing that will most likely cause World War III. So that's what's going on with AI. Yannick, you can add in some points later on if you'd like. Also, we're seeing a lot of blockchain enablement. TradeLens is a blockchain-enabled digital shipping platform that's being used by IBM and Maersk, and is getting some traction there in supply. Despite the recent stresses on the crypto space, Ethereum's decentralized finance ecosystem is also growing very quickly. The lending protocol there, Compound Finance, raised 25 million towards the end of last year in a round led by Andreessen Horowitz. So that's one massive investment into decentralized finance. I think my view is that blockchain's killer application will be finance. The same way for internet was media. Eventually, I think you'll see that blockchain will be on the finance space, especially if you see the original use case for blockchain, which was, of course, Bitcoin. You're seeing things like this where you can, Morpher, where you can trade stocks 24/7, pre-market and after hours on the blockchain, and think about the value proposition that presents versus what the existing options are for people. There was this debate again, and this spat between Google and IBM, whether Google had actually reached quantum supremacy. But the idea is of using quantum computing using qubits and getting to a point where we can do the forms of calculations that traditional computers can't do. And there's some, purported benefits that we could get from quantum computing. So things like drug discovery at molecular levels, personalized medicine. Could we cure cancer? Could we start to simulate very chaotic environments such as climate? So there's a lot of hope for what quantum computing could do. One of the main things quantum computing can do is break most of the encryption, pretty much that is in place in the world at the moment, including the encryption for traveling through the internet, and the encryption actually used for Bitcoin. So we'll see how we're able to develop quantum proof cryptography very quickly. And quantum computing is, again, it's following those exponential curves in terms of the progress that's being made. So it may be very soon that they're able to break some of the encryptions that we take for granted and we rely on as a species. Solar, if we look at solar prices, they've dropped 99% in 40 years. So if you look at this chart, you can see how solar prices have gone from somewhere around $101 of a solar panel per watt, all the way down to 37 cents in late 2017. And you can see on the right-hand side that installations have increased commensurately. And the idea is that they think by 2022 we'll be down to 24 cents a watt. So you're seeing why and how solar power is having such an impact. And think about the impact we can have when you get very cheap energy, or energy costs virtually zero. So things like desalinating water, the electrolysis for use production of hydrogen, where electricity is the major cost component. You start to see things that were once scarce start to become abundant. And this is what we're going to see in the world. The effects, the drop in electricity, this is China, this is a couple of years old, had halted construction on over 100, I think, coal-fired power plants in 15 regions. They may have started up a little bit again. If we look at India, look at the proportion there of renewable energy, and this is mostly an economic decision. This is not necessarily an altruistic one that we want to have renewable energy. This is literally driven by the economics. And if you look again at India, the yellow bar represents future installation in terms of where they think where they're going to be meeting the demand for that electricity. And you see how large a portion of that is now solar. So again, we're seeing that in some places, the cost of installing either a new wind or solar installation is cheaper than keeping a coal power plant running for a year. So just keeping a coal power plant running for a year is more expensive than installing a brand new solar or wind installation. It's called the levelized cost of electricity. We're also seeing DNA tests for children, saving them, from diseases. This is one from late last year, being able to tell what happens. Scientists is also looking at what's known as liquid biopsies, where you're able to test for cancer DNA in the blood. I think there's one company called Grail has had 1.6 billion invested into one of the largest clinical trials in history to be able to pursue this idea. And these are not things that are necessarily coming soon down the line. There was a urine test for cervical cancer, and the British study of 620 women, which could be self-checked. So these women could self-check their urine samples to see if they had presence of the virus that causes cervical cancer. And the interesting thing from this article was the urine tests were far more likely to detect the presence of precancerous markers than the existing tests that were out there. We're seeing things like, who's heard of CAR-T therapy? So I did with the Exo Works, we did a workshop with a company that's doing CAR-T therapy. And CAR-T therapy is where you take a patient's existing T cells and you adapt them to be able to detect cancerous cells and destroy them. This is mostly now for blood cancers, and some clinical trials have shown that 40% of patients who were basically at terminal stage for lymphoma, this therapy eliminated the cancer from them 15 months after treatment. So we're talking 40% remission completely in patients that were terminal. But even something like this is already being disrupted. Right now, to do a CAR-T therapy, what you do is you take the patient's own T cells away, and it's only on blood cancers. But we've recently seen a Belgian company which is now using what are known as allogenic CAR-Ts, which are off-the-shelf ones. So they're just generally available. You don't have to take them from an individual patient, and being used to treat solid tumors rather than blood tumors. And of the 12 patients in this study, 6 saw their tumors shrink. So we're getting very, very close, and much closer to kind of these effects and cures for cancer, or at least the effective cures for certain types of cancer. Right. Any idea what this little thing is at the end of this iPhone? I've been talking a little while. It'd be nice to get some comments. What do you think? Charger, interesting. Blood sugar. Okay. So this is a DNA and RNA sequencer that is planned to be coming out this year, right? It's not fully developed yet. It's from a company called Oxford Nanopore. And just in case you think that, oh, well, it's a future product, this is their existing one. And the MinION is the only portable real-time device for DNA and RNA sequencing. So they're going to shrink this down even further to be able to attach to the end of an iPhone. And it can generate 10 to 20 gigabytes of DNA sequence data, and it's been used on a mountain, in a jungle, in the Arctic, and also on the International Space Station. So we can now do DNA sequencing for something that we even us would think that this is some kind of microchip or blood sugar. You can actually sequence DNA. Yeah, exactly. That's why, Podromus, I like I like your comment. That's why I want your videos on, because I want to see your faces as I'm talking through these things. Here's another one, and this is a bit old. Back in 2015, a team of biochemical researchers figured out how to give a human volunteer night vision, enabling them to see across 50 meters in total darkness for several hours. And what they did was, and this is biohacking, so this was not a kind of a proper clinical trial or process, but they basically injected his eyes with a compound or substance called chlorine E6, which is derived from sea creatures and had been used for many years in cancer treatments. His eyes are black on the right-hand side because he's wearing contact lenses to protect his eyes. But yes, he could see in the dark for over 50 meters for several hours after this happened. Now, you might dismiss this because this was biohacking as opposed to some kind of professional or clinical process. But then this came out last year, is that the US government is testing nanoparticles that convert infrared light into visible light. They tested it in the eyes of mice, allowing them to see in the dark. It enabled mice to swim through a maze following triangular size. And the interesting thing for these mice was that the ability to see in the dark stayed in place for up to 10 weeks with no lasting side effects. And the idea is that the US military may end up using this for their troops as well. In terms of the CAR-T therapies and treatments, one interesting thing is that there are some similarities between senescent cells and cancer cells. And senescent cells are cells that have effectively stopped operating properly and are thought to be a major contributor to the physical effects of aging. When it was tested on mice, they gave a cocktail of, I think it was 2 different drugs to mice over 4 months. To mice that were naturally equivalent to the human age of about 75 to 90 years of age. Those mice lived 36% longer on average that had received this treatment, and they were no more frail near their delayed time of death than the controls were. Now, the interesting thing is that some of the treatments, as I said, for CAR-T could be used to attack senescent cells. So this particular company, Siwa Therapeutics, is looking at, I think it's antibodies that bind to human senescent cells. And the idea is that they could destroy those senescent cells. So basically an anti-aging treatment could potentially be in the works this way. But it may not be that you have to do it through antibodies. You may be other routes that we have. Lifespan is a very good book on this. And the good thing for most of you people on this call is that you're young enough that you could get to a point where you reach something called human longevity escape velocity, which is coined by Ray Kurzweil, which is that for every year you live longer, technology figures out a way to make you live a year plus longer at the end of your life than that. So effectively you get to a point where you never die because of that technology. And he thinks that's coming quite soon. Here's another one. The world's first human monkey chimera was created in China last year. It was led by a team of scientists, and it was done in China to avoid legal issues. And the idea was something that's been done with, I think it's with pigs, around growing human organs, and then was to be able to grow human organs within these monkeys, into these chimeras for transplant purposes. By the way, that's not the actual monkey. I just put a cute picture of the monkey up there to freak anyone out that might think that was the real monkey. So that's not, they didn't actually create it into a real monkey. What they did was they just created the embryos. We've had a lot of talk about kind of self-driving cars on the roads as taxis and autonomous vehicles. That's already happening. China's Uber has, I think this was done before the coronavirus crisis, was self-driving taxis. This is quite important because if you imagine you get to a point where people don't need to own cars and you don't need to pay for the driver in the car, as an Uber, it drops the cost of transportation rapidly. And it makes things like, the use of car parks, the ability to work in the back of these cars. So now the transport time is not dead time. And say, for example, in London, the travel time to the center of London is one of the major components of real estate prices. So what happens to real estate prices when that's no longer an effect, that it doesn't matter how close you live up to a certain time because you can still be productive in the car. And also this would lead to a far lower death rate in terms of accidents. I think over 1 million people a year are killed, mostly men and kind of young to middle-aged. You know, what happens when we get to the point where autonomous vehicles now start removing and reducing that level of death? Has anyone seen this video here? I'm going to show you this from Boston Dynamics of Atlas, and it's called Atlas Parkour. So anyone having Terminator nightmares right now with the ability of what some of these robots can now do? So this is the Boston Dynamics is obviously one of the main companies that's doing robotics, and you can see the progress they're making there. Even on things around VR and AR, recently we saw some articles around synthetic skin being able to bring the sensation of touch, which is one of the challenges with using VR and AR. And they said that they were able to potentially create that realistic sense of touch without by measuring skin deformation in there, and that could potentially be something that could make VR and AR even more interesting. I think one of the airlines at the moment should really thank their lucky stars that the virtualization of travel hasn't happened yet in terms of headsets and people being able to get the resolution so they feel like they're really on holiday. Because if you look at what's happened with Zoom and the virtualization of work due to this crisis, we may never go back, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happening that towards the end. Okay, any questions or any comments on what I've gone through so far? Or you're a little bit in shock? Everyone's quiet. Helena, why don't you make a comment? I like seeing faces when I give this presentation. I give this presentation to a bunch of people that are kind of part of a high net worth network, and some of the drawers are dropping. Awesome. Thanks, Yannick. Okay. So let's look at what this looks like in terms of the disruption this is causing and what is happening in terms of wealth. So this is a list of, which is probably growing now by the day, of bankrupt US retailers. And what we're seeing is massive retail disruption we've seen across the world. So JCPenney, for example, dropping over 90% in value, whereas companies like Amazon has just been taking off. Walmart is the only retailer that seems to have been able to keep pace with Amazon. But if you look across there, we've seen some real damage. And of course, what's happening right now with the coronavirus is just pretty much accelerating this trend. What we're also seeing is this concept of the reduction of the marginal cost of goods and services. And I talked about this with solar, where we're seeing solar and wind as well, leading to drops, massive drops in the cost of energy, to the point where we may get to a point where energy is virtually, it doesn't actually cost anything, or cost very little. It's not a factor of our thought process production and what that might have as an impact on us in society. Education, you're seeing it's effectively possible to get a full university degree online now. You don't need to go to university. You may not get obviously the credit, but the education is there. We're seeing automation in factories. Lots of these kind of companies coming out, the sharing economy, and effectively some of the challenges are you've got a lot of benefit from this reduction in costs, but the automation also has a damaging effect. And some studies have shown that by the end of 2012, the US economy had made a complete recovery from the 2007 to 2009 recession, and output was higher, 2.2% higher, but they were using fewer workers to achieve that. So they had 3.84 fewer workers than 2007 in 2012, only 142.4 million. So we're actually seeing that workers are being displaced. And again, I think the coronavirus will just accelerate this trend of unemployment. And I'm not sure how many of those 3 million plus, I think in the US now, we've seen a jump in unemployment claims. How many of those jobs will be returning following what might be up to an 18-month coronavirus period. Some of the things that this disruption is bringing as well is, the smartphone has killed multiple industries. We talked about digital cameras, but let's look at, MP3, portable musical players, navigation systems, camcorders. And this is a result of that 60s model I talked about, where we get technology that becomes digitized, then it becomes, disruptive, and then it demonetizes to a point where, nobody would now pay money really for a portable media player or a GPS or a camcorder or digital camera unless they're very high end. In fact, you would have to pay someone to take those now because they'd clutter up their home environments and they wouldn't want all that extra, all that stuff in them. So it's very interesting how this has happened, and we're seeing this in multiple industries. Now we're also seeing wealth being disrupted, and this is important because I think a lot of traditional wealth families or wealthy companies seeing that their mindsets around how the world works, how exponentiality work is being disrupted. So this is from a group called the Barclay Brothers, who bought the Telegraph newspaper back in 2004. And back then they bought it for 665 million, and almost 1 million people read that every day. And that 2004 was the same year that Harvard undergraduate called Mark Zuckerberg had changed the name of his startup to Facebook. And we go forward 15 years, and now sales of the Daily Telegraph have fallen by a third, or 2/3, sorry, and that's like somewhere around 360,000. And their profits have dropped from 14 million to less than 1 million. And we've seen what's happened to Facebook. And these kind of very wealthy, very smart investors held this newspaper through all that period of time. So we're seeing such a change in what's happening with wealth. Also, some other concept to think about is that these exponential technologies, they have what's known as convergence. So they don't sum, they have a product impact of each other. So for example, robotics is that the product of AI plus 3D printing of the bodies, plus cost of energy, plus the cost of storage and the batteries, plus computing power, plus material, times material sciences. So it's actually the product of all of these things. And as each one of these technologies follows its exponential curve, the combination or convergence of those leads to even faster impacts in those particular services of robot, technologies where they're used all together. The other thing we have is a number of technology laws that have been running for several, decades even. So I know we talked about Moore's law, as we've said before, but there's actually others. So I'm going to go through them quickly. When we talked about the law of accelerating returns, that shows Moore's law was actually the fifth paradigm. We also have Kumi's law of computing efficiency. And that's been going since 1945, which says the number of computations per joule of energy dissipated doubled every 1.57 years. So the amount of energy to do a certain amount of computations is on an exponential curve that's been doubling consistently since 1945, every 1.57 years. Swanson's law, which is around solar voltaics, it says that the cost of solar voltaic modules tends to drop 20% for every doubling of shipped volume. And that's been going since 1976. And at present rates, costs go down about 75% for solar voltaics every 10 years. Nielsen's law of internet bandwidth says a high-end user's connection speed grows by 50% per year. So this is just a little bit, 10% less than Moore's law. And this data has been going since 1983 to today. It's like a 36-year period that this has been consistent. Gilder's law of bandwidth says the total bandwidth of communication systems triples every 12 months. So we have a tripling in bandwidth of communication systems every 12 months. And again, this law has been going since the year 2000. There's another one called Edholm's law, which says that wireless, nomadic, and wired networks are all in lockstep and they're gradually converging. And this law has been true since 1970s. And this is my favorite. This is, let's go back one, Cooper's law. And this has been going since Marconi made his first transmissions in 1895. And it says the maximum number of voice conversations or equivalent data transactions that can be conducted in all of the useful radio spectrum over a given area doubles every 13 months. Now, this law has been consistent for over 100 years, and it's important to think about what will happen as that law keeps going, and we start to be able to use our radio spectrum more and more efficiently over time. We've got the Crider rate, which is slowed down. It was called Crider law. And it says that magnetic disk storage density was then around about 40% a year. Now it's at 50% a year in terms of the price performance of that. And many people don't talk about this, but I think a lot of this is all driven by something called Wright's law. And what Wright's law says is that the cost decreases as a power law of cumulative production. So in effect, what it means is the more we produce something, the better we get as a species at producing it, and then more the price performance increases. And a 2013 study by researchers at MIT showed that this was the greatest predictor of technological progress, and could be the thing that's the foundation of all of these other laws. And the reason why this happens is because of our technical learning, because of economies of scale, because of the convergence effect. And this is actually probably one of the most important laws to pay attention to. This law may become very relevant for Tesla and the way Tesla produces its cars, because I saw a study saying that actually Tesla will be, using their, or be able to take advantage of Wright's law as it increases production to lower the production costs of its vehicles and batteries. Now, this is important in terms of what we're looking at in terms of businesses and companies, is that any company designed for success in the 20th century is basically doomed to fail in the 21st. So it's not designed for it. This was a picture of all the unicorns. These are private companies valued at 1 billion plus. Back in August 2018, there were 260 of them. Now I think this was back in October, in 4 months, 49 additional companies became billion-dollar valued through to that. And what we're seeing is that unicorn velocity is also increasing. So the time it takes for a company to hit the 1 billion valuation is getting shorter and shorter. And these are what are known effectively as exponential organizations. And these are companies that leverage new technologies and processes to be able to do 10x the output of their peers. And you see some examples there. Now, I know the coronavirus has had an effect, but some companies such as Airbnb are better placed to weather the storm than, say, someone like Hilton, which has a larger cost base, where they own the hotels or they're leasing them from operators. One thing all these companies are taking advantage of is what's known as the Exo Attributes. And this is where my company comes in. This is what we're based on. Is we did a study a few years back of all the fastest growing companies in the world, and they all seem to share 11 key attributes. One was a massive transformative purpose, a massive vision. You could say Tesla's is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy, and that's kind of their North Star for guiding them. And I won't go into all these on detail, but on the left-hand side, you have what are known as the scale ones, which enable you to scale quickly. And on the right-hand side one, you have what are known as ideas, which enable you to absorb that massive scaling, because if you don't have the processes internally to be able to manage it, you can become soon overwhelmed. An example could be, how often do people call Uber customer services and speak to someone on the phone? You don't, because the interface, which is the first one on the ideas, is able to handle a huge amount of volume through its design. We're seeing a change in products to services, so going to kind of online services instead of ownership or leasing of things we've seen with Dropbox. We're seeing more and more platform-based business models, and we're also seeing ecosystem-based business models. So Google is now becoming very much an ecosystem model. WeChat in China is one of those as well. And what we need to look at in terms of what we're seeing is exponential operating systems being able to be implemented. So a question for you all, and I'll get to some of those questions. I think I've seen Anastasia's one as well, so I'll come back to that in a minute. Question for you all, and put some comments in. What does a traffic light enable? What's the main purpose of a traffic light? I'm sure most of you can answer these ones. Interesting. Yeah. Point A to point B. Order may not needed for self-driving cars. Interesting. Yeah. So do you think a traffic light is there to help people slow down? To help cars slow down, to stop cars? Because what I would say is manage traffic. Yeah. on occasion. So if you come up to an intersection where the traffic lights are broken, do you speed up? Would you slow down? Right. So, and I think you've got these right. I think a lot of people don't get it right. Is that actually traffic lights enable that traffic flow? They enable speed. So without the traffic lights, actually things slow down. And what we're likely to see is more operating systems, such as blockchain AI, being implemented where they actually remove friction in the environment. What we're also seeing is, and this is good news for a lot of you, is that industries are completely blindsided by outsiders. So it's outsiders a lot of the time coming into industries that are disrupting them. And the way it's done a lot of the time, and Elon Musk in particular does this, is looking at these exponential curves and starts investing 10 years or more outside of those curves to intersect those exponential curves and to see what happens. Okay, so again, gone over quite a lot there. I've got some few questions here. And internet speeds. Okay, so I've got not very positive. Yeah, it's true. Anastasia's comment is I'm not necessarily saying all of this is positive, but I think some of these trends are kind of they're almost unstoppable in a way. Like they're happening and they're going to continue to kind of happen. And I think it's similar to say something like email, where email was said, oh, email will improve things, it'll create more efficiency, work from home, virtualization means that you have to work less, and all that happened was the working time kind of expanded, and you see people working on their commutes as well. So yes, I agree with that, and actually, yeah, that could be the problem, is that that environment, say in a self-driving car, is no longer used to be kind of relaxing time, and there's an expectation of constant productivity and work. So it's important for us to be able to manage that as human beings, and in terms of the culture. Yeah, exactly. You can count it in sometimes. Can exponential growth when we change trend flattening? There's a chart actually, Prodromos, that shows from Ray Kurzweil, and he's basically plotted the entire evolution of life on an exponential curve. And you see actually that from the start of life, he draws it, and it's almost literally a straight line on an exponential chart of how life itself has progressed. So I don't think you can slow down this exponential progress unless it's something drastic like a nuclear war or climate change, or potentially a very, very deadly pandemic. Those probably are the three things that I think would slow down or slow this exponential progress. Yeah, coronavirus, not quite, maybe not coronavirus, but a highly deadly strain of the coronavirus. I think it's three things. It's pandemics. Oh, actually, it could be more than this. It could be pandemics, world war, climate change, or potentially something like an asteroid strike, where anything that has a massive impact on actually human population, individual humans at large scale, are the things that I think that could slow this down. But otherwise, yes, it's these curves, and you see some of these laws have been going on for a very long time. Questions also was, what's the point of knowing these? I think it's important. I'm going to show you kind of why it's important for us as the, maybe not me, but some of you as the younger generation, to think about this, because a lot of people are not aware of these changes and the impact they could have on individuals. I'll just quickly move on. So some things around the coronavirus impact, you'll see I've cleverly used the image could not be loaded tag there from Google Slides. So we're seeing companies are facing disruption in pretty much every area of their business due to the coronavirus. And I just want to kind of cover this quite quickly for you. Some scenarios for what we might see. Does it become dormant, like Middle East respiratory symptoms, where, say between December and January, there were only 17 new cases of MERS. So it kind of sits on the surface, but doesn't kind of have that effect. I don't really think that's going to happen. I think it's more likely that it's going to become a more of a permanent feature, either as something that comes in seasonal waves, or something that we all need to be able to be vaccinated against and develop some form of immunity to. And as I said, there's a high risk, not high risk, the risk of mutation. The Spanish flu wasn't the first wave in 1918, but it was actually the second wave that was very, very deadly. And I think in the US alone, almost 200,000 Americans died in October of 1918 due to the Spanish flu. So that's something that we need to think about in terms of what could happen and the risks there. If we look at coronavirus, it has already started mutating. These aren't massive mutations, as I understand, but if you look at Next Strain, which is a source, it'll show you how those mutations have happened. So this lends me to think that, which I'm not a viral expert, but it lends me to think that this is more likely to become something that's seasonal or something that kind of sticks around, where we need to be able to develop our own forms of immunity, whether it's through vaccines or whether our own immune systems developing it. We've seen a lot of debate about mitigation versus suppression. And as you see, most countries are following suppression tactics to avoid their health systems being overloaded. And there's obviously a massive economic cost, and a lot of us, obviously, almost all of us, are kind of locked down at home. What could happen, say, in the UK, this is a report from Imperial University saying that you have to apply these suppression in waves of the next 18 months, potentially, to avoid basically the health systems being overwhelmed in any country. So maybe that's something that we need to switch on and off. Basically, keep your eyes on countries like China, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan. See what happens as they start to lift their suppression of the suppression tactics to contain the virus, and do we see an increase again? If we do, it may be that us in Europe and in the US and other Western countries and other later countries may find that it's an 18-month process to be able to contain this virus. But let's see, hopefully it won't be. And in terms of organizations, again, thinking about for business or thinking about for your companies, Hilton, for example, had 33,000 rooms empty in China, whereas Airbnb wouldn't have had that same impact. But we're also seeing forced experimentation and acceleration due to the crisis. So we're seeing new business models being developed, and we're seeing some really positive stuff around 3D printing, for example, being used to create ventilator valves in Italy. You may have seen that news report, and face masks as well. So adapting snorkeling masks to become ventilator masks. So you're seeing a lot of very positive experimentation. And as someone said, it's you can see that there's those valves there. And there's the Chinese movie company that tried a new business model with ByteDance, who came up with TikTok and using ByteDance to distribute the movie. And as someone said, never before in history has basically the entire world been focused on solving one problem as they are with the coronavirus. And it's something that, even in something, say, like the world wars, there were people solving problems, but they're solving it, in competition. And I think, as to quote The Martian, basically humanity is sciencing the shit out of the coronavirus. So let's see what we get to. But, there's positive ways of thinking about this and a lot of experimentation that's happening as well. Post-COVID-19, we may see some changes, and people are talking about what does this look like? This may have a positive societal impact in terms of more openness and collaboration. It's forcing baby boomers online. It's basically the largest universal basic income experiment in history, with people being just given money. It's a bit artificial because we're locked down at home. We're seeing unemployment rates increase rapidly, but they may stay high. People adopting exponential technologies. There's shift in values as well. So this understanding of the fragility of life may result in differences in the way we consume and have positive impacts in that case as well, in terms of how much time we spend with family and where our attention and energies goes as individuals. Politically, unfortunately, there's some negative signs about people using a crisis to remove rights, the concept of the state of emergency being permanently etched in. I think this week Hungary's parliament was voting on, creating a 2-year permanent state of emergency or an ongoing state of emergency. I don't know what's happened with that, but there's some very kind of negative potential impacts of the crisis. Even the UK government was looking to instill a 2-year law, to give them powers for 2 years, and then there was challenges to that, saying why does it need to be a 2-year law at the moment, even though we don't know how long this is going to last. But again, in countries like Denmark, we've seen this energy for collaboration. I think they have a coalition, several party coalition government, and they're working together to solve this. On the economic side, we may see low interest rates, and we may see kind of hyperinflation potential risk as well. So these are all things to be aware of as we're going forward as leaders. And that's that comment around the rule of law under threat as well. We'll see lots of technologies as well. We may see countries now wanting to localize a lot of production, so you don't have that kind of risk with things like needing to ship in food or lab-grown meat, 3D printing of products and services, solar, drone deliveries, virtualization, as you've seen as well. So a lot of these things to pay attention to and think about what might be happening in the future. And in terms of kind of organizational, companies are likely to think more in terms of being resilient and having lower cost bases, unfortunately. So we may see, as I said, employees not necessarily returning, and increased automation and virtualization happening in companies. Any questions on that before I talk about, kind of the summarizing that leadership, or what the implications are for you in terms of leaders in this time? And Alan Flowers, yes, there's likely to be a corona baby boom by December. I think they're called the perennials or something, that we're likely to see a certain increase in the birth rate happening around then. So any questions on what I've covered so far? Okay, cool. So let's quickly go around kind of what this means. Perennials, new word, yes, it's a lot and very fast. Don't worry, Anastasia. Yeah, so it's trying to get you. What I wanted to do is give you things to think about, as opposed to giving you all the answers right now. So the purpose of this talk for me is to give you the framework to think about stuff, and you can always ask me questions afterwards or at the end. But I think it's important to, when you don't know what you don't know, it's hard to kind of make progress. So I think in this case, it's giving you the ideas and mental models, and hopefully as you start to learn more information, you can use what I've covered to kind of hang things off. And this will obviously be recorded, is being recorded and will be available. So we know the UN SDGs and the goals, so about leadership in exponential times. When I look at this chart, I always think there's one missing, which is the bottom right corner. And I'll tell you, I won't ask you what this is, but for me, this is what's missing, is actually leadership for the goals. And I think if you look at the SDGs, I think the lack of leadership around them is what's causing them not to be implemented effectively in the world. And what we're actually seeing is this, is non-leadership. And that flame takes on a very different meaning, right, when we see this. And what's happening at the moment is our existing systems were designed for a world of 50 to 100 years ago. And the new technology impacts we're seeing, the societal changes, and now COVID-19, these are all moving almost too rapidly for existing systems to keep up. And this is resulting in some of the things we're seeing, like unemployment rise at the far right, this fear. We're also coming to the end of certain macro cycles, which I'll talk about as well. And it's not even people losing their jobs, it's robots losing their jobs to other robots, and this is already happening in this. We're seeing this, and as I said, I talked about this, and this is due to the fact that our brains prefer linear thinking. So looking at some of this exponential change, we struggle with, and it's quite deceptive. Now let's have a look at this kind of chart that I showed you before, and this is kind of the computing speed on a linear scale. And I think that I'm going to explain this in a way that I think is the only way I found to get people to understand that what exponential change actually looks like. So effectively, this is what the curve, everything I've shown you to date, and it's 2020 now, it's not 2018, on an exponential curve, if we go back from 2028, looks like that. So we have literally just done the little bit of uptick at the bottom of this exponential curve, going out to 2028. All the things I've talked about in terms of quantum computing, night vision, it's just that little bit of the tick there. Yeah, that's why. This is where people really get it. And let me tell you the other thing. We are always at that bottom tick, that bottom uptick, whether it's 2018, 2020, 2025, 2030, right? That's what exponential change really looks like. And that's what we struggle to understand. And I think that is the way to land it for people, is we are always on the curve and always on the uptick of a massive change coming over the next 10 years. And that's why we struggle to understand it. So what is exponential leadership about? To me, and this is a quote from David Roberts, and I very much agree about this, is exponential leadership is about non-change. It's about the things that are not changing, and what we need to do is, as leaders and individuals, to address those things. Remember I showed you this chart going down to the cost of it and the abundance of light, and how amazing that is. But then this still happens, and we have discrepancies in wealth distribution. This is Daniel Cabrera, who's a homeless 9-year-old when this was taken. And roughly 1/4 of the Philippines, 100 million people still live on less than $1 a night. And giant slums still dominate the cities. And he was here doing his homework by the light of a McDonald's. So the challenge is that I've shown you all of these great exponential curves and some of the changes that are happening, but this is not distributed evenly. And if we see also, there's been a disparity and a shift in terms of absolute wealth versus relative wealth across the world over time. And you can see on the right-hand side of the chart there, how that's kind of manifested over time in terms of the real income since 1948 between the top 10% and the top 90%. And this is quite important for us to think about as leaders, because this has an impact. Now, the things that human beings don't do very well looking at absolute wealth versus relative wealth. What I mean by that is if we're an individual and we have, even if our whole living standard is increased 10 times, but someone else's has increased 30 times, as a human being, our natural tendency is to say, well, why has that person got 30 and only got 10? Despite the fact that your living increase had been 10 times. And I'll show you this really good video.
We get engraved and you will see what happens.
Of monkeys.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
So that's an example of absolute wealth versus relative wealth as human beings and individuals. So we need to think about these things as leaders in terms of what's happening in the world and the role we're playing. Now, what do the lessons of history tell us? So generally, when we see this kind of disparity, usually it's resolved by revolution. And there's a very, very wise book called The Lessons of History, written by Will Durant. I would 100% recommend all of you read it. It's a very thin volume, and it's a gentleman that did the whole history of civilization. He won a US presidential medal for it. And in that, he describes how over time, capital will accrue in the hands of those most skilled to use it, and you'll get greater disparities until you have revolution. But it's not necessarily the case that always we have to have revolution when this happens. On the right is Solon, who was an Athenian statesman, lawmaker, and poet. And he instigated a lot of changes in Athens, which managed to save it from revolution back in around 600 BC. He devalued the currency, he reduced all personal debt, ended imprisonment for debt, cancelled arrears for taxes, and he created an income tax that had the rich pay it 12 times the poor. And that's what I'm not saying that's what's needed now necessarily, but that was the level of intervention that was needed, and that was able to kind of reduce and save Athens. And he's credited with laying the foundations for democracy, the first kind of instance of democracy as happened in Athens. Now we're also seeing, interestingly, there's new access to becoming global leaders. So you all know who she is Greta Thunberg. And what people forget is that first picture was taken, I think, around August or September, in I think 2018. And 1 year later, in 20th of September, 7.6 million people marched globally. So she went from being a schoolgirl sitting outside the Swedish parliament to inspiring 7.6 million people to protest globally in basically the space of a year. So what's happened is the changes that we've seen in the world have enabled individuals such as ourselves to have that level of exponential impact in the world. And this is what I'm talking about, leadership in kind of exponential times. This is something just to show you interesting in terms of what we need to understand the impacts of exponential technologies. And what happens is this is the cost of sequencing a genome. and effectively between 2007 2011, it fell from 10 million per genome for sequencing to $10,000. So in 4 years, you had that kind of 1,000-fold impact or reduction in cost. Now, think about kind of what becomes possible and what becomes possible for people as you start to see it. And last check, it was down to 1,000. It's kind of slowed down, but it may carry on. Let's see what happens with that and then the benefits that could come. Remember, I showed you this picture of kind of 90% being able to tell people who are criminals or who weren't. You're going to hear a lot of these kinds of stories coming out, and you've got to look at them with a critical mind. And the reason is that what they found was that they were able to tell who they were by looking at 3 critical areas and tell who the criminals were, which was determined by the way the upper lip curved, the distance between the inner corners of their eyes, and the angles between the 2 lines from the tip of the nose to the 2 corners of the mouth. Effectively, they were saying that if you're not really smiling that much in the picture, you're a criminal. Now, remember where the criminals' pictures were taken. They were taken in police stations. So even though this neural network was able to identify these people by 90% accuracy who were the criminals, maybe what they were looking at was just the emotional state of the person, not the facial features around whether they were actually a criminal or not, based on where those pictures were actually taken. So you've got to take all these kinds of stories that you hear and think about them. The other thing that we need to pay attention to is, and a lot of us are think very important around having positive impact and looking at impact investing, which are kind of things that affect the SDGs. Impact has always been about wealth creation. It's just our definition of what is impact has changed over time. 100 years ago, having a positive impact in the world was laying the railroads or creating the oil pipelines so that we could have expansions in population, and fuel human progress, for example. Once upon a time, I think in very many countries, you still had period poverty where girls couldn't attend school because there weren't, sanitary towels that were widely distributed. Private companies stepped in and created that, and that still happens in developing countries around the world. But the point is that looking at terms of having an impact in the world has always been around also wealth creation, and what we're seeing is this alignment between companies that are trying to do good in the world, but also kind of creating wealth or impact for themselves. And I think these things are starting to align quite clearly. If you look at things like solar or wind, and again, if you're business oriented or entrepreneurially oriented, this is actually a very positive message that having a positive impact in the world is also something that's actually good for you as well, and it always has done. So I think just to finish off, that us as human beings, we have 2 purposes as individuals. One purpose is universal, and it's common to all, and that is to become the best version of yourself you can be. That's not that easy, and a lot of it is involved in becoming the best version of yourself is doing things that you don't want to do. So I'll tell you the secret now, and this is what I've learned from a particular person, but it's kind of a common message, is that doing the things that you don't want to do but you know are good for you are the things that will make you become the best version of yourself, right? I'll leave you to think about what those might be. The other thing is about having what's known as an individual or personal massive transformative purpose. So as we see Elon Musk, as we talked about, he'd created Tesla and SpaceX and kind of gone that way. And if you look at kind of the massive transformative purposes of Tesla, which was to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy, or the other one that he created, which was SpaceX, was making humanity a multi-planet species. You would look at this and think that, he set the massive transformative purpose, and that, then he went out and kind of did those things. I think it's the other way around. I think you set a massive transformative purpose, and that creates who you are. So if you look at someone like, Elon Musk, the chap on the left, who's the one that created Zip2, he could never have created SpaceX or Tesla or do the things that are currently being done. And actually, by setting yourself these massive transformative purposes for yourself, this is the second purpose, I say, and this is individual to everyone. It's what is the impact kind of you want to have in the world. And this talk is also about challenging your assumptions. So my question to you is, what if you're wrong about the assumptions you have about yourself, you know, about who you are and what you're capable of? And I think if you look at that gentleman on the left, I'm not, you know, holding him up as a hero necessarily, but as an example. He then would not necessarily have known what he was capable of in terms of creating SpaceX and Tesla. And by creating these massive transformative purposes, the second purpose, I think you create yourselves. And I'll give you some good examples of people, like say Freddie Mercury, the lead singer at Queen. He was a baggage handler at Heathrow Airport. Gandhi only returned to India when he was 44, and he was a South African lawyer before that and was never interested in politics. And this only changed after he was discriminated against and bullied. Even Martin Luther King, you know, the reason why he was actually involved in the civil rights movement is because the bus boycotts happened around where he lived, and he wasn't necessarily that keen to get involved initially. So a lot of these things, what we see is actually setting the transformative purpose is the thing that you do, and then it creates who you are. You are forced to bring out of yourself and take the actions to be able to deliver that. So that's the kind of summary of this. Two purposes: become the best version of yourself you can be, but also set yourself a massive transformative purpose, and see what that makes you become. That's it on the exponential leadership side. And I'll leave you with this kind of quote, which you may have heard of, and this obviously applies to women as well. It's just an older quote. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world, whereas the unreasonable one persists to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Okay. So my message to you is to be the unreasonable ones. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks for paying attention. It's a bit longer than I planned to go for, but any questions on any of the stuff I've covered? I know we've got some there. Helena, any things that you've noticed that are interesting? Go.
Thank you, Sol, for this great presentation. I guess like a lot of ideas were now super new for us, and it's a bit of mind-blowing in this time of quarantine to now listen to this presentation that has so much connection to the world that we actually don't even see our window nowadays. So I think we can still use the remaining or last 10 minutes to ask questions. So if you guys have some, please go ahead.
I'll just answer. I got a question from Alan, which was around the COVID-19 charts. So if you look at, I'm not sure which one, the one that looks at the mutation of the virus is on next strain. So NEXT and then strain. I think that's online, you can find it. And it also look at the Imperial College's report 9, which showed the kind of idea of suppression waves. That report has been challenged, whether or not that's actually going to happen that way or not. But that would be another good thing to do. There's lots of reports out there. My favorite resource for things on the coronavirus is Our World in Data, which is from Oxford University. Their COVID-19 page is excellent. And they're very, very rigorous around the data that they use and the trustworthiness of it. So if you want to see what's going on in the world, I would look at that. Okay, awesome. So yeah, as I said, so the idea was to not necessarily give you answers, but to give you frameworks. So now you know what things to be thinking about. So as you go out into the world and you're thinking about things, especially things that we've seen with disruption to our societal institutions. And some of the things that we're also seeing is that we're coming to the end of some quite large macro cycles. So one is the macro debt cycle, which I don't know too much about, but it's something that Ray Dalio talks about. We're seeing that, you know, this disparity in wealth is kind of increasing and getting to a breaking point, which is the end of another cycle. We're also seeing the rise again of potential, you know, nationalism, which is again, it's another cycle that occurs through humanity. So these are the things to be aware of as leaders is, you know, where are these macro human cycles? Where are we at and how are those playing out? Any thoughts, advice on how we protect ourselves against developments we do not like? Would be the type of person who can change or influence those where they can. So I think individually it's very difficult to shift things in terms of the trajectory of humanity. Everyone can have kind of little localized impact, but I think certain trends are kind of just continuing and will continue. But I think there's a lot of positivity. So for example, if you look, there's something called evidence of abundance, right? So if you Google evidence of abundance, there's some charts that Peter Diamandis has put up, and that shows you some very, very positive news around charts that show how much progress we've made as human beings, and it's stuff that's not reported in the news. Things like child mortality drops, female education, female empowerment, deaths from road accidents, deaths from terrorism, deaths from war. And you see all of these curves are on massive reduction. They're all reducing very, very quickly, for some for hundreds of years, as I've shown you. So actually, as a species, on the whole, we are getting, everything is improving. It's just these things are not reported in the news because the news needs to sell advertising. And the thing that we pay attention to is fear-based messaging, not positive messaging. So you'll always see negative messaging in the news because, the purpose is partly to sell advertising. But really to get, and Anastasia, I know this might have affected you, but I've seen some of your comments. Do look at Evidence of Abundance, that website from Peter Diamandis. You'll see some really positive stuff. I haven't gone through all of it. I gave you some examples, but some really good stuff in there. Okay, awesome. Any other questions or comments? Sorry, I'm leaving you guys a bit stunned here, but that's fine. That's the purpose of the presentation.
Actually, it's me. I'll just chime in by voice because it's easier than typing.
Yeah.
I'm just lazy. But thank you again for your amazing presentation. I remember very much how good it was for the old version of it in Berlin at the alumni reunion, and I loved it. And now again, just sort of you've woken up some parts of me that were almost going back to sleep now. But I found actually that sort of EYP really showed initially how many incredible people can come together in one place and how they can approach problems. And I think if we keep that in mind as we get older and don't forget about that fact and try to recreate sort of an EYP-like problem-solving environment, we can attack a lot of the issues. And I think there was one question earlier about sort of is this positive or is it negative? I think it's really our turn to decide that and to figure out how we can turn it positive and how we can use the technologies for the good things for our ethical sort of direction that we want to take, and not let other people do it instead.
And I think this is a very important point is, as I'm leading, I'm the lead currently for the coordination group for the alumni. We have alumni that are parliamentarians around the world. We have alumni that are professors around the world that head up, that are partners at companies like McKinsey. We've got 3 people in the Scottish Parliament currently who are EYP alumni, ambassadors. So actually, I think that the EYP is a network of people like no other in the world. Like, honestly, we experience it at such a young age, 16, 17, 18, that it becomes part of our DNA, this concept of tolerance, openness, working collaboratively. And, I've met, I did my EYP session, first one is like 25 years ago, right? In 1995 in Milan. But I can meet someone that did their first session 5 years ago and I can connect with them and I have a joint understanding with them, right? And I don't think this is transactional. I think a lot of networks you see around the world have a transactional element to it. But the EYP network, especially with the alumni and current EYPers, it's not that. It's very genuine. It's literally in our DNA. And I think that we talk about having an influence in the world as individuals, but there's 200,000 plus EYP alumni out there in the world. And if we as a group of people could coordinate, I think we could do some amazing things on this earth, given where we are, where EYP alumni are around the world, the skill sets they bring. We've got people from every walk of life, every skill set. Prime Minister of Croatia is an EYP alumnus as well. We're kind of in a lot of places, and I think if we can align, I think we could do some very positive things. Yeah. Awesome. Oh, last question on the near future of quantum computing. I don't know, to be honest. I think just look at the doubling rates. People were saying, I just look at how fast the qubit rate is doubling, and then you can judge at which point the number of qubits would enable, say, the break of quantum, break of current encryption systems, or et cetera, et cetera. So see, that's how I've looked at it. I did some calculations a while back. I've lost them, but yeah, that would be interesting. I think how long till the technology goes on large scale, no idea. I think, you've got the race between IBM, Google. I don't know who else is competing on quantum computing. There's suspicions that there are quantum computers in places that are, intelligence agencies have them, and no one knows like how fast they're working on them. But yeah, I don't know. You'll have to see. What usually happens is that there's a quote that says the future is already here. It's just not widely distributed yet, and that's to do with cost and the ability to kind of distribute it around. So we look at what quantum computers can do today. Extrapolate out 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5 years in terms of the qubits and the computing power, and then say, okay, maybe it might take 10 or 12 years or 15 years for that to kind of become widespread. I don't know if we'll all have quantum computers at home, or if it's something that would be more centrally managed. Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise we can wrap up. Awesome. All right, so do look out. I think in terms of resources, sign up to some of these newsletters. There's Peter Diamandis has one, which is Future Loop, I think it's called, which gives some Singularity University puts stuff out. I'm part of a network called Open EXO, and EXO Works is a company that's part of that. We're holding a 3-day event called EXO World, which unfortunately costs $300. So I'm not sure if that'll be something you'd be able to attend. That's a 3-day event that's coming up, virtual event on redesigning institutions for the future. So look that up as well, see if that's something you'd like to attend. Okay, awesome. All right, and quickly, Helen, I've got, just for those whilst on the call, I also have a talk on mental models for personal effectiveness. So if that's something that interests you, let Helena know, and then it's a shorter talk, about 40 minutes, and that could be something useful for our lockdown.
Yeah, I think it will stay in quarantine for a longer time. So after 20th of April, it will be decided like whether we're staying still at home or something.
No, we're going to be at home.
Okay, so if we will be still home, we'll definitely run another volume of alumni webinars with another 7 webinars, and you will be, of course, one of them. But we can have yours anyway, regardless of quarantine. It's always great to have a bit of soul in our projects.
Thanks, Helena. All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. Thanks for your attention and sticking with us, and I appreciate that.
And hopefully to see some of you at the alumni reunion who are alumni already.
Awesome. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.